descent into madness. I am Marimo. I am a game developer. I just flew in from San Francisco. I've worked on a couple titles you might have heard of. The big one I'm going to be talking about is Monster Train, which was localized into 6 different languages that I had to work on for about 2 months, and it destroyed me forever. Our publisher told us we need to support these particular languages, which is already a lot. Each language has its own unique needs, and we're going to just break that down. They also told us, just in case, be ready to support these languages as well. So of course we're going to talk about Japanese, even though we didn't localize into it, because this is an anime convention, we have to talk Japanese. So here is the agenda of my rant, and hopefully by the end of it I'm going to sound like a crazy person, and hopefully I sound a little more sane right now. So let's start with why localize. For the first point, it's pride. You know, we want people to play our games, we want people to experience the media we create. It makes us feel really happy. We're all egotists. Like, you can't work in entertainment unless you have a bit of an ego. But the real reason is money. We need money to survive. I mean, that's what it is. If you put it in another language, somebody who doesn't speak English will be able to experience that work. Same with bringing Japanese anime into English. So here's a little chart I grabbed from Steam showing global traffic, and you can see sort of where the big countries are. The biggest are, of course, the US and China. There's a big contingency in Europe as well. So this sort of informs the decision of, if you had to only pick a few languages because you don't have the budget to support everything, you know, take a look at this, make an informed decision based on that market. So before we really get into the nitty-gritty about it, let's just do a compare and contrast of the difference between localizing anime and localizing video games, which really is the difference between localizing static and dynamic text. If you don't know what that is, let me explain. So static text has a one-to-one translation. There is a line, it is said, you will just translate it once. There's one line in Japanese, one line in English, one line in French. The context doesn't change. And I'm not trivializing this. It's very hard to do this right. But it's a little easier than video games because it is a one-to-one relationship. Whereas with dynamic text, things change. Like right here we have an example for Monster Train where it says spikes 4, but you could upgrade the card, now it's spikes 8. And there's a +4 for that damage indicator, and that could upgrade too. So it's not really a one-to-one, it's sort of a many-to-many type of relationship because there are variables and parameters. If you're playing a video game, you name your character, right? That name is going to show up in text somewhere, so you have to anticipate the fact that that text can be different based on the type of name you put, and that might have a problem in some languages. So let's do more examples. With static text, if you're just going from Japanese to English, one-to-one, there's a lot of localization choices and style choices you have to make. That's going to be true for any translation, especially if you don't have context, but not too bad. Let's compare dynamic text for a bit. So you will see these sort of squiggly lines with numbers in them, and that's representing a variable or a parameter. So in this case, you have like oha 01, and the 0 would be whatever the name of the player is, and then in Japanese, that 1 may be a kun or a chan, depending on the set gender of the character, whereas in English, not all of those variables might be used, because you could add a san or a kun or whatever honorific ending you want to add. It doesn't really make sense in English, so you might just opt not to do that. And this is where you get into some really interesting scenarios when you start breaking it down. Because, for example, you're opening it up to human error if you write your replacement string wrong. This is a famous example from Final Fantasy in Spanish, where they have this replacement string for the character Rosa, but they didn't write it correctly. And so it's shipped like this. So, donde está mi hija, name Rosa, close parenthesis, question mark. And it gets even more finicky when we consider the fact that not all languages follow the same grammar rules. I already explained that parameters in one language may not be used in another. And to prepare text for other languages, you kind of need to understand how those work just a little bit. You don't need to be fluent, you just need to understand what are the needs of those languages. And the problem is, most US game developers, as an example, have no idea what the other considerations are. If you go back to even older games, a lot of Japanese developers only made it for the Japanese market. You think about the first Final Fantasy, you know, they didn't anticipate that to be localized everywhere. So you run into some weird scenarios where the grammar works in one way in Japanese, but it doesn't work in English when you try it and you need another variable, but they're not providing that variable, and so you just have to make a compromise at a certain point. But if you do understand some of these other languages, especially your target languages, you can prepare for that. Here's a little tangent. Literal or machine translation. This is a cute dress-up game that did a little bit of a machine/literal translation for quite a horrible effect. I was just at GDC, or Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. I've had a very busy week. I've been flying around all over the place. And I met some developers who said, oh, I use ChatGPT to translate my game into English. And I was like, can you show me the text it gave you? And you know, they're not native English speakers, so that's why they went to that tool. Yeah, I suggested they might want to save some budget. Right now it's not good enough. Maybe one day, maybe one day. Okay, so the first topic of localization is getting English into English. So, okay, what is up with the SZ that I'm putting up everywhere? And some of you may already know this, but English spelling changes depending on where you are in the world. They're not consistent between regions. So, let's do a quick little game. Which is which? We have Canada, the US, and the UK. Can you identify which is which? I'll give you a minute. You think out loud. Scream it. Why not? All right. So you maybe have figured out which is in American English and which is in British English. Don't know how many Canadians are in the crowd. Any Canadians in the crowd? Canadian. You're Canadian. Do I count? No. So here's the answer. And you may notice that Canada has something interesting going on with analyze and traveling. So I asked one of my friends on Discord, who is Canadian, and a lawyer actually, and I was like, hey, do you say fulfill or fulfill? Yes. He said, traveling or traveling? Sure is. So okay, it's not even consistent depending on the locale, but where are we going with this? If you're writing in English, stick to your locale. If you know American English, write American English. If you know British English, write British English. It's okay for a British person to read American English. They're not going to be super offended. They will be offended because you spelled color wrong. It should be with you, but they're not going to be super offended. In fact, you look at the Pokemon Sword and Shield, they were using a lot of British English even in the American release just because that was fun and it was in a UK-inspired land. If you are translating into English, you probably should just pick the US because market size, unless you live in a part of the world where British English translators are more available. And you probably don't need to pay for English to English localization unless you're a really big franchise, and even then, you gotta just question if it's worth it, because as different as it gets, we can still understand each other. Now let's talk about French. I'm gonna give you a cautionary tale, and I'm gonna give you some real-world examples of me understanding French and my coworkers not understanding French, and the massive fight that went to the CEO to resolve. So, French has accents. These are not optional. Some people think they are. They're not optional. You have the cd, right? It's for français. You need to put that there. If you don't put it there, it's not français, it's franquais. That's wrong. It's français. It's a different pronunciation. If your fonts don't support these characters, because there's Latin and then there's Latin extended, you're going to need to pick some new fonts. So the first font we picked for, say, Monster Train, I didn't pick it, somebody else did. They don't work for the company anymore. It didn't support these accents, and I told them, like, hey, our publisher says we need to support French. We need a different font. And they're like, I don't believe you. What's not to believe? Look at it. So when you make your initial font choices, you better be prepared. In addition to that, French has distinct quotation marks that are not the same as in English, and some people just don't get that. You also need to make sure your font supports this if you are using these characters. French people get really mad about it if you don't. And then my favorite concept is the non-breaking space. So certain grammatical marks in French have a space before them in addition to after. If you're putting a question mark in French, there's a space before it as well. But that space is not the same space as the space after. These are actually different characters entirely. The one before is called a non-breaking space. And that's very important because it means you cannot break to a new line, whereas the character after will allow you to break to a new line if the text is multi-line and long. This is really, really important. French people take it very seriously. We're going to talk a little bit about localizing just grammar things like this. That's coming up later. You need to make sure your font supports that non-breaking space as well, because your translator is going to give you the line with that character. And if you don't support it, it might show up as what we call the tofu character. It's going to look like a little square. And you're going to see a square n-dash space, and you're just not going to understand why. And then you're going to look at the line and say, I must have not supported this character, and you're going to think it's just a space. And you're just going to be so confused for like the next 2 days on what happened, unless you speak French. My coworkers, I try to warn them about this, because I had to study French for 6 years. And my sister's a French major who lived in France. And I've lived in Canada, I'm not Canadian. And my coworker just said, I don't believe that's how French works. And I was like, do you speak French? And they're like, no, but I don't think that's how it works. This is what I was getting at earlier, that if you're leaving to just Americans who don't understand other languages, you're going to run into problems. The next day, I came with a French copy of Le Petit Prince, and I said, hey, check this out. Because everything I'm saying is in there. The quotation marks, the spaces, and then they were just like, well, yeah, but that's a lot of work. Because it's up to the engineers, who are not humanities people, who don't speak other languages, to implement this type of stuff. It sucks. It eventually escalated very much. There's more escalation coming. So let's do a little quick tangent about puns and translating puns. Puns are very language specific, and they're one of the hardest things to translate, so you just have to accept the fact that not all your jokes are going to work. A lot of times, a translator, and I know a couple who do manga translations, they just get a spreadsheet of lines. They get no context. They don't even know who's saying the line, which is a problem. That's a big problem. So if you are developing something, maybe in a metadata, in just another column in your spreadsheet, explain who's saying the line, explain the gender of that person as well. That's going to be really important for languages like Italian. And if it's a joke or a pun, explain the pun. And I'm going to give you a good example from Monster Train. We had an achievement called Sans Serif. There's a boss named Serif. Okay, Sans Serif. It's a fun little joke, not an Undertale reference, I promise. In French, Serif was translated as Seraphine with a PH. So the achievement Sans Serif in French became Sera-Fin, which is beautiful. All of the puns in French were amazing because I spent a lot of time writing, explaining jokes. Like, normally you're not supposed to explain a joke, it ruins the joke. You have to explain jokes to the translator. They need to be able to translate it. It worked out really well. So let's talk about Spanish and Portuguese. It's ultimately going to be a business decision. So let's do a brief history of colonization with the S and the Z, or Z, because hey, if you're British or Canadian, it's Z, not necessarily Z. There's a lot of different countries that speak Spanish. And at one point, thank you, Bill Hurst, for this graphic, the Pope said this half of the world is Spanish and this half is Portuguese. It was a different time. So there is way more language diversity in something like Spanish than there is in English. In English, color, has a different spelling. In Spanish, mobile phone or a computer has just a different word and a different origin, which makes it very, very difficult to translate because you can't do what I said you could do in English of you could just pick one and it's acceptable. In Spanish, it doesn't work. It's two different languages practically. So ultimately, if you're choosing one, what I've noticed is that American devs will pick like Mexican Spanish because it's right there and it's easy to find translators. European devs will probably just pick Spain Spanish because again, it's right there and easy to find Spanish translators. But if you're from Portugal, you're out of luck because Brazil is a huge market and it's bigger than the Portuguese market. So you're just going to pick Brazil no matter what. Nintendo has a fun caveat. Notoriously only does Spain Spanish. Part of this is that Nintendo of Europe is a European presence, so they have more easy access to Spanish translators from Spain. But I'm not going to give specific examples because this is a PG panel. Some things that are normal to say in Spanish come out as like slurs or super offensive in Mexican Spanish. So if you're if you're speaking any Latino American Spanish and you're playing Pokemon, some characters say some things that are just absolutely wild. I would have included screenshots. I don't think it's appropriate to show it at 11 a.m. I would highly recommend you look it up because it is so funny, especially if you speak any of those languages. But Spanish in general is going to be really difficult because I don't even know if I listed every single country that speaks Spanish here. I tried. There's probably one I missed. There's a lot of people. Let's talk about German. German is the most anti-UI language. So in addition to everything we said about French, you need unique characters, your font choices need to be specific. German words don't really like having spaces. So
let us combine all the words into one French word.
So you have the Bundesrepublik, the Federal Republic. Sorry for my trash accent. I'm not going to even try to say federal constitutional law, but that's just one word. So in English, you're like, okay, there will be a space or a hyphen or something where I could break the character and go to the next line. You can't do that in German. To the point that when I talk to other developers, like at GDC where I was, they all tell me when they localize to German, there's somebody on the team just doing a German custom code. Like, if German, do this. And it's one of the only languages you have to do that. And we had to do it 2 months in training. Because automatic rail spikes is already kind of taking that UI space, and then the translator gave us that on the right. I'm not going to try to butcher this language, I don't speak German. So we had to say, okay, can we crunch the text a bit, make it fit? It was a nightmare, because the very first time we did it, it was just the text is overflowing everywhere, and text is now overlapping because everything's overflowing, and it is something you don't have to think about necessarily in anime subtitles. Yeah, lines can get long, and you might have to break it up a bit, but in web apps and mobile apps and games, you need to fit it in the screen in one place. Good luck. Okay, we're going to talk about Chinese. Because now it's going to get even crazier. So we already had to deal with choosing different fonts that support all these characters in these European languages. And you might have multiple fonts. And then you have to make sure all of those fonts have the correct characters. Let's talk about Chinese. So first off, a little preface. You cannot mess this up if you are translating into it. It is the second largest gaming market after the United States. Do you like money? Because I do. So don't mess it up. And this is the severity I was trying to bring to the table when we were working on our titles, that, hey, we need to support Chinese. We need to make sure it is perfect. We cannot fail. And guess how many people at my company speak Chinese? Actually, just one. But he wasn't working on the game. he was the art director. Anyway, if the translation fails and you don't get money and you get a review bombed, you might lose your job. So, that's the severity here. Or that should be. So first, how many characters do we need to support? This is not even close to all of it. The left side are the radicals in Chinese, and the right side is I just clicked into one of those radicals to list all the characters that use that, and it doesn't even fit. It cuts off at the bottom. There's way more. So there's a lot of characters. If you imagine video game file sizes, we're going to run into a problem real quick if you have 5 different fonts in your game. So, even grammatical characters, and I said I would get back to this. Chinese, Japanese, it's all about character width. Every character is the same width. It's different than in English. You think about the I in English, it's very thin. You think about capital B, it's a lot wider. That's not true in Chinese. Characters are the same width, including grammatical characters, full stops, colons, all of that. That's very important because if you do it right, you're going to get this really nice, beautiful, square design where everything's aligned and it looks really good, and then everyone's going to be really happy, if you care. So this means even your grammatical dynamic screens need to be localized. So if you look at English, there's some variable, colon, space, another variable. That's 2 characters, the colon, space. In French, you have the non-breaking space, the colon, the regular space. Hey, I told you we can get back to it. That's 3 characters. Chinese, Japanese, it's 1 character. It's a full-width colon. Does your font support a full-width colon? That's another one you need to support. And then it gets to the actual character choices. So, okay, I'm correlating the Taiwanese, the Chinese, and the Japanese flags here. It's just correlation, it's not causation. We'll get more into that. Traditional simplified Japanese, they all use sometimes different characters for the exact same word. This means iron, it's tetsu in Japanese. Don't ask me what it is in Chinese. I don't know. So, are you supporting all of this? And do your font choices support all of this? Because you might grab a Chinese font and say, oh yeah, that's good enough for Japanese, and then it won't have the kanji on the right. You might grab a Japanese font and say, yeah, that should be good for everything, and you're going to miss out on a lot of other fonts. So, it might be you need to get a lot of fonts here. So, let's be mindful. Most Americans who don't speak these languages will pick the first font they see and say, that works, and you might have just picked the equivalent of Comic Sans in that language. And this happens all the time, and all these international audiences see it and they're like, oh look, it's the game using that Comic Sans font again. Yay, they don't care about us. And then you'll get review bombed, possibly. So be a little mindful, and if you can find somebody who speaks that language, please use them as a resource. But let's talk about font atlasing, because there's a fun story I learned about the development of the recent Tomb Raider Lara Croft reboot game. So normally, you're not including the entire font in your game. You're going to atlas it. You're going to make a single texture, because there's going to be GPU performance. It's going to look something like that. And then it's basically one image that has all of your characters like pre-built into it. So this is really nice because you don't need to put every single character in that font into an image. So atlases usually get baked dynamically based on the characters in use. Now what happens if you do that for Chinese, you're not putting all the characters in, and you patch the game because you changed a line or something, and now there's a new font that wasn't in that atlas. And this happened with Tomb Raider. The story I learned from one of the project managers of that was that the dev team decided to be really, really precise, super optimized, get perfect font atlases for this language that they don't understand. Then they had to patch the game, and it was needed to be a hot patch, and it was like long enough ago that they didn't want to just waste all this bandwidth. They didn't want to push out like a 500 megabyte update for a quick hotfix that changed like a typo. Right? Because then audiences will be like, why are you destroying my bandwidth? The problem is the translator gave them a character that wasn't in the font atlas. So they went back to the translator and said, can you translate this in a different way? And that doesn't really work in Chinese because they're like, it's like volcano. Like, how am I going to translate that differently? But you want to just call it like fiery mountain instead of fire mountain? Like, I guess we could do that. Imagine that happens in English. That'd be really weird. They give you the word refrigerator, and they say, no, we can't do that. So you say fridge, and they're like, no, we need something else, and you just end up saying cooling cube. And that's kind of the equivalent in Chinese of what happened there. So of course Chinese audiences saw that and were like, what is happening with this translation? Nothing makes sense. Why is it being written this way? So that's why I said, God have mercy on your soul, because you want to bake these atlases, but like you may run into some issues, and then you're stuck with it. So, okay, Mandarin, Cantonese, simplified, traditional. The writing system is technically independent of the speaking system. So you will write in either simplified or traditional characters. You would speak Mandarin or Cantonese. There is a correlation. Simplified is usually used for Mandarin. Traditional is usually used for Cantonese. That is just a correlation. You absolutely can use traditional with Mandarin. So if you're dubbing your game in addition to just translating the text, for one, you probably have a lot of money. For two, you want to make sure there are separate toggles that changing the language of the text is independent of what's being spoken. And that's a good thing, because you think about something like Genshin Impact, you can play it in Japanese dialogue, English text. A lot of people prefer that. That's how I play it. A lot of people like to just change the language on the fly. Sometimes they do it as like, how does Venti sound in Chinese? I want to know. So, your players will appreciate it, but it will also help with your localization, just in case you hit somebody who speaks Mandarin but wants traditional. So don't assume these are the same things. But it benefits everybody, so I would highly recommend doing that if you can. Okay, so finally Japanese. So I heard you like pronouns. This is not an alt-right thing, I promise. So let's do a quick recap of basic pronouns in English. In English, we do it maybe in one of the worst ways possible. We have all of these that are not gendered except for the third person singular, the he, she, etc., etc. So okay, we all understand that. That's where this origin is. Whenever we hear he, him, or she, her, it's the subject object. As a tangent, this is not true in every language. We're not talking about Turkish much, but in Turkish there is no gender associated with these pronouns. Okay, so pronouns in Japanese are a little weird because they have pronouns and they are gendered, technically, but it's more common to just say their name or title. So you could say like kare for he, but if you know that person's name, you might just say, oh Mike-san. Like you just say their name. Similarly, you could say anata for you, or if you know their title, you can say, oh, sensei, because that's the teacher. And so some people think Japanese doesn't have these pronouns because that's so common. They do technically. A poor translator will just use the direct pronoun, and a good translator will pick up on the context and make it sound better for a Japanese audience. Now let's talk about the first person singular in Japanese. This is from a Japanese variety show, and we are going to give big shout out to Legends of Localization, Clyde Mandolin and Tomato, who provided a lot of this information. One of my friends works at Funimation, translated Dragon Ball Z, One Piece, Attack on Titan, Mother 3 fan translation, that's that guy. Huge shout outs to him for giving me all of this information, including this graphic. He's a great person. Even among Japanese people in Japan, their first person singular gets nuts. I could do an entire panel on just this, really. This could go on for over an hour. But I kind of like it because it is a tangent, but it's self-expression at the best. If in English you're relying on he, she, that's third person. Somebody else is describing you. You put all the power in their hands to get it right. In Japanese, these first-person pronouns, some of them have gender information, and as a first-person pronoun, only you are using it, so you have complete control over your own identity. And so because of that, it's used in entertainment in sort of weird, fun ways. You get a lot of neo-pronouns in Japanese because they have a pronoun for if the character's a samurai. They'd say seshu. And that, nobody says that in real life, but they were like, oh, you got a samurai character? Use this, it makes them sound like a samurai. And you can do other fun things with the Japanese language, and a good translator will do that. So let's take a look at some common first-person pronouns just in Japanese. Originally, this was like 20 slides, and I had to cut it down for time. So if you've ever wondered what the connection is between Gendo and Amber, you have it here. They use watashi, which is the standard basic, it doesn't really have gender information, but it's also kind of badass if you use it in the right way. It either means they're very plain, or it means they're so confident they don't need to address themselves in anything but, the basic formal way to say me, myself. This was a very weird slide to put together. I had to stare at it for 5 minutes. I'm like, am I sure I want to do this? Continuing the Genshin trend, we have Boku, and also the Evangelion trend. Boku is used as a more boyish term, so if you also want to know the connection between Shinji and Venti, here you go. Tell your friends. I'm sure they will appreciate it. Another one is ore, which is very cool. They're a really cool person. It's a very masculine pronoun. Boku is masculine as well, but games like Mother 3, for example, it can be used in a tomboy context. You get a lot of tomboys, or even female characters that say ore, and it gives a different energy. It's are they a tomboy, or are they just boyish, or are they, possibly trans? Who knows? I mean, you could play with it, have fun with it. The problem with translating to and from Japanese is you have so many in Japanese, and it's such a cool language concept, and you just don't have it in English. I'll leave the slide up for a bit, just because it looks like some people are taking photos. Legends of Localization, it's one of their top articles. Clyde Mandolin, Tomato, that's where I got this graphic from. Big thank you to him. So, going back a bit, if you provide your spreadsheet of terms to translate to Japanese to your translator, and you don't provide context, and you don't provide gender, and they don't even know who the speaker is, they're just going to say watashi. Because that's always correct. There's a fun game where it was a big, burly, dwarf character who's speaking in English. He was like, "Hey, what are you doing?" or whatever, and it was apostrophes, and it was all fun and fancy. And the translator didn't have any context and assumed that, we should do Valley Girl. And so in Japanese, this big, burly, bearded dwarf was speaking as if they were a gyaru. And Japanese audiences were what is going on? And even big AAA budget games like Skyrim in Japan, there's mods for Japanese Skyrim to just fix all of this because it's so wrong. you get things in Stardew Valley where they're like taking multiple lines and putting it together into one. So suddenly a character's pronoun usage just rapidly shifts where like it's like super feminine and sweet and then it becomes like big and like tough and you're going like, what is happening? Like it just keeps changing and like Japanese audiences are like, this sucks. Like this is really bad. So encourage your translator not to just use watashi. Put in that metadata, just explain what's happening to them. If you know Japanese enough, because you're a weeb or whatever, you can give them some suggestions. You can say, hey, like, maybe Boku would work for this character. Have you considered that? You know, they get the final say. You let the translator translate. You don't have to hold their hand. But it is super important that you just give them information. The other thing to remember is that even in Japanese, pronoun usage isn't static, it's fluid. I think Final Fantasy V in Japan had a character that started using like watashi, like super formal or like super like larger than life. Bad things happen to this character. The character's pronoun starts changing over the course of the game. It goes down to like watashi. I was like, oh, okay, you're going like more like you've lost a bit of your identity. And that was part of the character's story. And then by the end of the game, they're using a different pronoun. They found a new identity. And that's like you could convey character growth in that way, which is really, really cool. The problem is English doesn't have this. So if you're translating from Japanese, don't try to force the concept into English. One of the hardest things about localization versus just a raw translation is that these concepts get flattened. Like there's these amazing concepts in Japanese, it's flattened. And then it's up to the localizer to find a way to hint at what the original text was saying by making English-specific or language-specific choices. A girly character might say atashi. You can't, it's just going to be I in English. But you can try to give them, quote, girlier language. So let me talk about the Ori-sama to your boy Guzma pipeline. Guzma, in Pokemon Sun and Moon, in Japanese uses Ori-sama. That's like, super like, okay, you're just like a bro, right? You can't, it just becomes I in English. So they decided like, oh, what if you said your boy Guzma? Because that's not in the original text. And that's like a perfect way to translate that. It gives the same vibe, it gives the same energy, and it becomes a meme in English ultimately. So just, these are considerations of just, this is true not just for video games, this is true for any Japanese to English translation. So that's kind of what that's all about. So we're going to talk about Russian in just a bit. 3 plurals, yes, get ready for that. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're about halfway through, this is great. So, numbers are the actual final boss in translation because it doesn't work the way you think it would work in every language. Every language is so different. So you have 3 types of numbers, grammatically. Cardinal, 1 day, 2 days. So the number here is day and days. Yes, we actually do conjugate our nouns. People don't think about that in English, but we do. This is a conjugation technique. Ordinal, 1st day, 2nd day, 3rd day, 4th day. What is going on with English? Why do we have that? Ranges, 1 to 2 days. And this is just the integers. These are like if it's a whole day. Some languages, if it's like a fraction, it's like a half day, oh, you're doing a completely different thing. It gets nuts. We're going to just stick to the integer numbers here because that's going to be way, way easier. Okay, there are 6 integer cardinal categories when it comes to numbers that you will encounter throughout the languages of humanity. There might be some languages that do more. These has seemingly covered all the major ones and a lot of the minor ones too. So in English, we only use the 1 tense and the many tense. We say 1 day. Otherwise, we just, or sorry, 1 and other. Otherwise, it's days, right? So day, days. We have an exception for just 1 day. So we use when the quantity is exactly 1. That's a tense in English. So even if it's 0, if it's 2, if it's 10, it's 11, whatever, that's how English works. So because of that, people think this is singular plural. That's true for English. That's true for French. That's true for a lot of European languages. That's not true for every language. English is 1 and other. That's the sort of Unicode standardization that everybody came up with. So Japanese, as an example, is just 1 tense. So you have counters, you have different numbers, and the numbers are changing. Kuruma ga 1 dai arimasu, kuruma ga 3 dai arimasu. You know, the counters will change, but the word for car here is kuruma. The word for car does not change in Japanese regardless of the quantity. It's just kuruma, kuruma, kuruma. whether you have 1 or 3 or 276 cars, that doesn't change. So, what does this have to do with Russian? Russian uses 3 different tenses, with an exception. So here, I said when the quantity is exactly 1. I said when the quantity is greater than 2, but still small, and when the quantity is larger than a few, but we're going to get into it. Anybody here speak Russian? No. How about Polish? Anybody speak Polish? Okay. If you speak Russian, Polish, or Ukrainian, you might already know this. So Russian has the tense when the quantity ends in 1, but not if its end is in 11. It has a tense if it ends in a 2, 3, or 4, but not a 12, 13, or 14. So there's a little visualization down here on which form of the word you use based on the quantity of it. Your localization systems with dynamic text, going back to that, this video game specific thing, needs to be able to show these different forms based on the quantity. So, thankfully, game engines to the rescue. A lot of game engine tools and localization tools exist. Don't try to code this yourself. Like, at work, I brought up this concern with Russian, going back to this. And I was like, we can't just do singular and plural, because the only thing they coded was English, singular and plural, and they wrote an exception in English. And I was like, hey, how about Russian? And they're like, we'll call it plural plus. I was like, what is that? That's not what it's called. Don't do this. I was like, okay, what about this other language we might have to support? What about Japanese or Chinese or any of that? Because they do it differently too. So, in English, you would sort of define your strings like this. That 0 is like variable 0. Colon, you put the singular tense for English, you pipe it, and then you put the other tense. And the game engine localization system should hopefully understand how English works, and I put a US flag there instead of a British flag. I'm making a statement. So in English it's banana, bananas, but in Russian it's banan, banana, bananov. And that's it sounds so fluid in Russian when you say it with the numerals, which is why it's important. Now, luckily, if you do things right and you create your game text correctly, when you provide it to a translator, the Russian translator is going to know what to do because they're Russian. Is this a lot of work? Yes. It's a lot of work, and it became a big problem at the company I worked at because I was basically saying throw out everything you've already done because it's wrong, and implement a completely new system for a bunch of languages you don't speak. And it elevated to the CEO level eventually because there was pushback for months because engineers are lazy. We are lazy people. That's just what we are. We don't want to do work. We want to do the minimum amount of work and get paid for it. But is this worth doing? Yes, because English needs it too. If you do this to support Russian, you've supported English. Because English has card and cards, and draw 1 card, draw 2 cards. You got 1 apple, you got 2 apples. Old games would be you got 2x, apple, open parentheses, S, close parentheses. And it just looks weird and wrong, and you don't have to do it that way. We have the technology to do it better. So it is absolutely worth doing it if we can. Let's talk about art. This is my favorite part. I only put 1 flag here, there's many, many more. So, everything everywhere all at once. We have gendered pronouns. Even our second person. You got third person pronouns, he, she, even the second person you is gendered. You cannot say you to somebody unless you make an assumption on their gender, and it has to be in binary because non-binary hasn't reached the language yet. So you just have to guess if you don't know, and that could be a little awkward. Plural categories, I said there were 6 of them. Arabic uses all 6. It's one of the few languages to use all 6. Welsh is another one. They're not related. Don't know how that happened. Do you need unique fonts? Yes, you need unique fonts. Do you have language-specific grammatical symbols? Of course we do. It reads right to left, so you gotta kind of just flip your entire rendering around, which you might not be able to even support that. The letters are connected. The letters change their shape based on where they are in the word. You conjugate nouns as well, so you need even more context and more dynamic strings to get that right. You have optional diacritics for emphasis, sometimes not optional. What's a diacritic? It's a little vowel symbol you put near the letter because they don't use vowels in their language because it's a Semitic language, and Semitic languages don't put their vowels usually if it's an abjad language. It gets nuts. It's a growing market, but here's my advice, don't do it. The ones who have money, they speak English anyway. The ones in Dubai with like $1 bajillion, they speak English anyway. I can say this because I'm from that area. They speak English, it's fine. You could dub it into Arabic, that's different. Just good luck translating that. Some engines, just straight up, you can't. Like older Unity versions, you just couldn't. It would just be like, sorry, we don't do that. We don't do that here. If you do have to localize it for whatever reason, step 1, yell at whoever's giving you that instruction. Step 2, pray that somebody on the development team speaks the language, or just hire somebody, because you are not going to get it right the first time if you don't know what you're doing. This is one of the most complex languages out there. Same with Hebrew, same with, you know, any other like Semitic languages that reads right to left. Okay, why am I ranting and why am I so passionate about this? When we did Monster Train, I put so much effort, like 2 months of my life, into screaming about just this, and I'm not even the localizer. I was just a gameplay programmer. I was doing damage numbers and combat systems. And I just noticed there was a problem with our systems that was wrong, everything was bad. But I put a lot of effort into this and fought for it a lot. To the point that there were comments when the game came out in French, where they were saying in French discussion threads on Steam, they were surprised that this game was made by an American, because the translation was so good, the localization was good, the language specifics were, you know, we were aware of it. In Russian, they're used to really crappy translations. They were saying, for once, it looks like a Western developer cared about us. They started telling their friends. We looked at our analytics and we were like blowing up in Russia, blowing up in France, blowing up in China, especially in China. Because it's one thing where like you just really want to play the game and you'll just tolerate a bad translation and you want to recommend it and you just have to recommend it with like a caveat like this. By the way, translation might not be that good. They didn't have to do that here. In fact, they said, by the way, translation is good. And like that's true for anime, that's true for video games too. Like, whenever we hear, oh, the dub is good, you know, that's really exciting for people. That doesn't always happen. It's been happening more and more now, thankfully. But like, you go back 10 years ago, oh, the dub was actually good? Like, people will check it out. That will get people to share it with their friends. That will get people to buy into your work. And I keep talking about money. It's not just about money. Like, you feel proud of that, you know? You put a lot of effort into something and you want people to experience it and engage with it. You're still in entertainment. You're still a content creator in not the YouTube sense, but, you know, you're making content literally. So that's why we do this. And it was really nice and reassuring to see, like, okay, that effort was worth it. And I was right. And then those people who were fighting me don't work at the company anymore. So, thank you for listening to my exasperated rants. I am rarely on Twitter. You can follow me there. We have a sequel or not a sequel, we have another game coming out. It's releasing early access, so only in English for now, but believe me, I've been bringing up the exact same concerns with them. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. That's you. Yeah.
So, from like an engineering standpoint, back to the Russian, you know, and the numbers, is there a specific pattern that can be coded in that they use to reference, okay, if this is the number, this is the 10th, the way we need to spell it?
Right, so the question was, going back to Russian, how do we like codify that for localization? I'll go back. Literally this is how you would codify it. So we have a variable. That variable is representing a number. And then you have all the plural forms after it, and the engine knows, because based on this scene right here, the engine knows, okay, Russian doesn't have a 0 tense. So the first thing I'm putting in is the 1 tense, banana. It doesn't have a 2 tense. So it has a few tense, it has a many tense. Okay, so the few tense, banana. The many tense, bananov. It doesn't have an other tense, but you would just keep piping that for the language, and it's the same in English. So using English as an example, you have the number and you want to say just how much, banana or bananas. So English doesn't have a 0 tense. It does have a 1 tense, so first thing over there, banana, that's the 1 tense. Doesn't have a 2 tense, does not have a few tense, does not have a many tense, has an other tense. pipe that, bananas. If I were to do another pipe for English, the engine will just be like, I don't know what that is, and ignore it. But that's how we would codify that. Any other questions? Yes?
Are you able to divulge which translation vendors you guys work with?
So the question is, which translation vendors we worked with? I'm going to go way up to the game here. Up we go. Okay. So, Monster Train was developed by Shiny Shoe, which is the company I work at. That's in San Francisco. It wasn't published by us. It was published by Good Shepherd Entertainment. This was kind of their biggest game. They are located in the Netherlands. So because we worked directly with the publisher found the vendors. I don't have the exact answer, sadly, because of that. If you were, if you're self-publishing or you had like a VN or something, if you're doing like a smaller scale thing, translators often will just find you. You have to try to determine if they're worth it. In that case, you're just going through an individual. It's not clear if they were going through an individual or like how they set up those business relationships. So sadly, I can't fully answer your question. Yes?
So if I understand it correctly, the onus is on the people who are working on the game to like translate stuff and not people who are from the languages that speak it?
So the question is, who has the responsibility for doing the translation? So the onus, your translator is going to be the one giving you the translation, but if you don't give them the tools to properly show their language, so this is why we're going to the Russian example and the French example and all these other languages that have this dynamic text with numbers, they're not going to be able to properly do their translation. So the reason we have, going back to the Russian thing I showed, the reason we provide a way to codify these different plural forms is so that the Russian translator can translate correctly. Otherwise, we're just telling them like, sorry, we're going to butcher your language even if you give us the correct translation. It is up to the engineering team to make sure their game supports that. And that's what I was screaming my head off about. Because the assumption is like, oh yeah, the translator will take care of it. It's like, yes, but then you have to put that in our product. We're the ones who have to integrate it. So that's where the responsibilities are. We have to integrate it. And if we do it badly, it looks bad on the translator. We put their name in the credits. Oops, we butchered your entire work. Now that's going to look bad on you if you're looking for future work. They don't like it when that happens. And I mean, the industry's so rough to translators. For that reason, some of them just don't want to be credited, which is awful. You should be credited for your work, and you should be proud of it because it's going to help you get more work. So if you care about their language enough to help, empower them to translate correctly, everybody wins, really. Except I guess, the only person not winning is the person who has to integrate all of it because it's going to take some of their time. But they will win eventually. Yes?
How common would you say it is for publishers to offer, like, in-house translation people?
So the question is, how common is it for publishers to offer in-house translation or just translation services? They better provide it, otherwise don't use that publisher, is my opinion. So if you're working with any big name, you're working with like the Devolver Digitals, the Annapurnas, like the indie publishers that really care, or you're working with like the AAA publishers like EA, Apex Legends was not made by EA, it's made by a different studio, I think partially owned, if not fully owned by EA, but then it's published by EA. At least I think that's how it works. Is it EA?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. I'm not spreading misinformation here. Fantastic. So EA would be like, yeah, we'll get you the translators, just give us the text. So this is something, at GDC I was talking to some like new, younger developers trying to find publishers for their game, and they needed translators. These were the ones who were using ChatGPT. And I told them like, this is something you need to make sure that they provide, in addition to all the other business and money problems, right? So thank you for the question. Yes, Howell.
What is the funniest mistranslation you've come across while working?
I don't want to say the Pokemon one. It's not even a mistranslation. It's just correct in Spain and not correct in Mexico. But there's a line where a character says something like, yeah, I'm gonna just relax for a little bit, and in like Latino American Spanish, it reads as, I'm just gonna a little bit. So, Personally, I think that just makes the game better. Like if you're fluent in, if you speak like Mexican Spanish, you're like, hey, check that out. It might be pretty fun. That's all I'm saying. Thank you for your question. What mage?
So I mentioned like Mexican Spanish and even different dialects and stuff. I noticed you didn't say anything about like the French they speak in like
right.
It's different from like French. Is that even a consideration?
So the question is, we talked about the differences between different Spanish types, but not French types, because yes, France also colonized a lot of the world, and there are different types of French all over the world. The difference is kind of where the money is, in that a lot of French-speaking or Francophone nations are in Africa, and they don't buy that many video games, because there's a lot of other things that we're considering. In terms of Quebec, because Quebec exists, the written French isn't super different. The pronunciation, I don't understand their pronunciation. But because Quebec is also such a smaller market in comparison, like, where's that graphic I had? That's me. Okay, so like, that's showing the whole of Canada, it's not breaking it down by province. And you can see it's like, it's not that lit up. So France, especially because the French have a point of pride about it, the French from France, is not really a consideration for most localization. However, if you're, a developer from Montreal, and there's big development studios in Montreal, maybe you'll consider it, but usually I see that they just use French France. Thank you for your question. Oh, okay, so if there is, I'm not super aware if there's, like, I don't know the full language divergence of it. It's not something where it's really come up for me in the past few weeks. There probably is, I just don't know it. I'm sure there's some, like, English one words that are in Quebecois. Let's see, it is almost noon, so I think we're at the end, unless there's one last question. Looks like we're good. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Really appreciate it.